Saint Lamardia bestowed a blessing on all, so this was the age of magic, when magic was perfectly commonplace. During this time, the power of the temple was absolute and unyielding, and in this temple, a girl of incredible power, named Hestia, was locked away for life. She was an experiment of the temple. Hestia spent her entire life in the temple being abused, and her flesh and blood used as magical artifacts. Hestia spent her days filled with loneliness and pain, but the temple also had her friends. There was a boy and a girl. The boy was brought in because of his magical powers and was also experimented on, driving him insane. This boy Hestia eventually saved, and they were happy enough, the three of them. It was a good time when Hestia, Jonik, and her assistant were together, but the happiness didn't last long. For all this time, the temple was about to break the seal, and to everyone's horror, the temple attendants succeeded, and the world's mana got out of control. However, there was one way to get things back to normal, and that was the way granted by the merciful Lamardia. Hestia had to be sacrificed to use her soul to restore the seal, and the temple workers decided and sacrificed Hestia. Hestia was begged not to go there and run away. Jonik tearfully begged Hestia not to die and not to leave him alone. He promised that Hestia would not be afraid anymore as long as she was by his side. And he didn't understand why Hestia cared so much about these despicable people and why she was forcing herself to make such a choice. He couldn't accept the fact that Hestia didn't care about her own life. He asked that Hestia give her life to him because he cared a lot about the girl. Otherwise, Jonikson promised that he would kill every single one of them. He didn't care if they were maids or loved ones. Love those who used Hestia's powers. He wouldn't forgive any of those people. So he asked that Hestia not go anywhere. Even despite such desperate requests, Hestia still came out. Hestia explained that she thought about it for a long time and realized that if only she died so that the others would survive, it was a small enough sacrifice to save the world. Eventually, Hestia sacrificed herself to tame the rampaging mana, and then Janikson gathered the disintegrated pieces of Hestia's soul. Janikson promised that until Hestia's soul was reborn one day, he would wait for her for all eternity, and he kept his word. For Janikson had waited 500 years for her in an immortal body, but no black-haired child was ever born. But Janikson never gave up. But suddenly at one of the balls, after waiting for ages, Janikson met Hestia, who had been reborn in the body of a girl named Cecilia. Name, hair color, and face, they were completely different, but this power that Janikson felt was definitely the same. But Janikson didn't know if Hestia would remember him, or if she would welcome him. But when he found Cecilia, he asked if the girl knew him. Cecilia looked worried and explained that there was hardly anyone who didn't know Janikson in these lands, for he was His Highness Duke Killian Janikson. And then Janikson realized that it didn't matter. Even if Hestia didn't recognize him, the most important thing was that they had met. He understood Hestia's desire to hide her true identity because she had suffered so much in her past life. So Janikson also understood why Hestia had made the hard decision to stay away from everyone. But the boy promised that things would be different in this life. At least that's what Janikson decided for himself. He realized that if he was disgusted with Hestia, she should try her best to get away from him. But he wanted to get deep into the girl's heart and make her become his. And he hoped that at least this time he could protect her. As he opened his eyes, Hestia heard a familiar voice. That voice belonged to Janikson. Then her mind flashed back to the last time she saw Janikson, and he begged her not to leave, because he would definitely be able to protect her, and also promised that if she died to save such horrible people, he would kill them all with his own hands. But in the end, Hestia finally woke up, and looking around, she didn't understand why she had had such a strange dream, but she realized that she must have fallen asleep suddenly. It was strange, though, because she had been reborn long enough ago that she still remembered the voice clearly. But afterwards, Hestia looked at her hands excitedly and realized that she had been sewing a dress before. Hestia was very unhappy that she had fallen asleep, for she was afraid that now she might not make it in time. In this empire, bastard children of aristocrats lived even worse than mere humans. But it was here that Hestia was born, in the body of the child of a count and his maid. Her name was Cecilia Eland. Now she no longer had her old name and was living her second life. Hestia was very unhappy that she had seen such a strange dream, and she was also worried about her unfinished dress, which Hestia was unlikely to finish before morning. But suddenly, she noticed that the room was very dark and suspected that while she slept, the magic light had gone out. Now Hestia would have to rekindle it, so she used her divine magic to illuminate the room. This light should be enough for Cecilia to finish her outfit in peace, but if she fell asleep again, the light could also go out, and that would not be good. So read out the spell and snapped her fingers. Hestia summoned a small bat. It was her familiar. Hestia made a request to the bat and asked that he keep a close eye on the light to make sure it didn't go out, and he happily agreed. Because Hestia had entrusted such a cute pet to keep the magic light on, it shouldn't go out even if she fell asleep. And the girl got to work. As a result, by morning, Hestia had successfully managed to finish the dress and turned it into a real masterpiece of art, and even managed to make it before the deadline. And Hestia hoped that she would be paid extra for such a beautiful job. But when Hestia looked back at her assistant, she noticed that the bat had started to doze off. So Hestia immediately realized why the lights had started to go out. Hestia looked at her assistant with displeasure and explained that she had given him the task of watching the lights, so he shouldn't be so negligent in his work. Finally, the frightened bat disappeared, and Hestia began to wonder if her sister would like the dress. Hestia hoped that the girl wouldn't get angry again, but suddenly she was approached and explained to Cecilia that she was expected. Hestia then realized that her sister must be awake, and if she was late, the girl would be very angry. So Hestia read out a spell, took her other form, and then took her dress and started to run away. Eventually ran into the room, she saw a disgruntled sister, Alina, who didn't understand why Hestia was so late. And Alina didn't understand what Cecilia was going to do in case Alina was late for Duke Janixon's banquet. Excited Cecilia, running up to her sister and carrying the dress, apologized to Alina, explaining that she had spent all night diligently sewing beautiful beads on the dress. But Alina did not understand how beautiful the jewelry must be to take so much time. Cecilia smilingly showed the embellished and finalized dress, and explained that because Cecilia was making it for her sister, she had tried to make it the best she could, and tried very hard. But Alina grudgingly inquired if her sister had time to sleep. She explained with a smile that she had time to sleep, and even made the dress, and asked that Alina not worry about her. But Alina calmly informed her that she didn't even think about worrying about anyone. Cecilia knew it was a lie, and explained with a smile that she wanted Alina to try on the dress as soon as possible, and then she took it and started to change. But at that moment, memories with Janixonum crept back into Hestia's head, and his threats to kill all those who had once been dear to the girl, and all those who had used her power. Janixon swore he would have no mercy on anyone. Cecilia didn't understand why she needed these memories, and why they were so unpleasant. She had been worried before, and even searched for records of past events, but nowhere did she find evidence that Janixon had carried out his threats. Besides, even though Cecilia had all her memories, her past life had to be in the past. So whoever she had been before, and whatever had happened then, she was now a completely different person, and lived by different rules of this world. But at that moment she was distracted from thinking by a disgruntled Alina, who demanded that Cecilia follow her as soon as possible because they were already late. Cecilia agreed and followed Alina. Hestia realized that now she just wanted to live her life as an ordinary girl, Cecilia Ayland. At this time, a restless servant looked around his master, explaining to Janixon that this way he could harm his health, and at the banquet the boy could finally rest. And then Kiliana Janixon finally remembered that there was a banquet scheduled for today. But that wasn't important. He was more interested in the news about Hestia. Well, when the servant was silent, Janikson became furious. He demanded an explanation from the boy as to why he continued to remain silent, and whether the black-haired child had not yet been born or had not been found. And then the worried servant promised that he would soon find some information. Janikson was desperate, for he heard the same thing every time, so he sent his servant away. Janikson didn't understand why Cecilia hadn't shown herself even once, and had she not thought of him at all. In all these years, Janikson had never once been able to forget her. 500 years ago, she had sacrificed herself to save people, and since then, Janikson had been waiting for her rebirth for half a millennium. So he wanted to know when they could finally meet again. Cecilia, who was walking next to Alina, convinced her that her sister was as beautiful as ever. But Aliena grudgingly said that she had always been like that. And Cecilia began to convince Alina that the girl would definitely be the center of attention of today's banquet. But Alina asked that Cecilia stop saying something like that. After all, today was a ball in honor of the victory of Duke Janikson, so she could not steal everyone's attention. But Cecilia persuaded her sister that her beauty could not fail to attract attention, and surely no one would be able to resist noticing her beauty. She was like a fresh rose, which could not be compared to any flower even in the richest greenhouse. Finally, Aline agreed with her sister, and then Cecilia was convinced that this girl obviously likes to be talked about her beauty. Cecilia came to the carriage and wished her sister a good time at the banquet, but Aline really did not understand her behavior, for Cecilia must go to the banquet with her, and Aline demanded that Cecilia should get into the carriage more quickly and not make her repeat herself twice again. Then the frightened Cecilia realized that if Aline already wanted to take her with her, she had no other choice. So Cecilia ran away to her room. She went to change her clothes and was even angry that Alina was so stubborn. Cecilia was worried because her affairs were really bad. So today was the full moon. But now she wouldn't be able to not go to the banquet, and Hestia hoped that nothing would happen at least until the full moon ceremony. Cecilia finally got dressed and got into the carriage, thinking that she almost died while running, because she was in a hurry and apologized to Alina for being late, because Cecilia decided to dress up properly so as not to embarrass her sister. But suddenly Cecilia noticed Aliena's insane stare. Alina wondered when Cecilia had managed to buy such a revealing dress. Cecilia was madly surprised by such comments, because it was the very dress that Alina had given her, because the girl herself did not want to wear it anymore. Then Aline demanded an explanation as to why Cecilia had painted her lips so brightly, but the girl awkwardly explained that she had not painted at all, and that her lips were red because of running. Then Alina couldn't stand it and threw the scarf to Cecilia, explaining that Cecilia was too young to show off her shoulders. It was very lewd. But excited, Cecilia explained to her sister that she had taken the scarf especially for Alina to keep her warm at night, whereupon Alina also gave Cecilia her jewelry, explaining that Cecilia was obviously going in a hurry, but she didn't have enough jewelry to accompany Alina to the ball, so Cecilia should have worn the jewelry. But Alina warned that it was very expensive, so it had to be handled very carefully. Cecilia promised to take great care of it, for she could not imagine how much it might have cost. But Alina explained to Cecilia that she was thinking about something silly, because Cecilia should just include this necklace in the expenses of the trip. After all, Alina was her chaperone, so she should look accordingly, though Alina realized that even this trip was foolish, because in her position, she didn't have to go anywhere and could just live in her house and let her and Cecilia find a suitable man. And they didn't even notice how fast Cecilia would grow up. But it seems Cecilia was absolutely not listening to her sister and was still looking at her jewelry, and then noticing this, Alina immediately realized that her sister really loved money and jewelry. So she asked Cecilia to stop thanking her and just keep the gift she had given her, because Aline didn't want Cecilia to live in poverty when she left the mansion after marriage. So Cecilia asked Aline to get married as soon as possible, because if she became the head of the house, Aline could hire Aline to work for her, and then they could travel together. In this empire, Women could also inherit the family's property if they found a spouse. Alina promised that once she became the head of the family, she would share the property with Cecilia and also buy her a rank. But Cecilia Leshy was smiling. Alina didn't understand what amused her because Alina wasn't just talking and would definitely do something like that. In fact, Cecilia realized that Alina was an infinitely stubborn girl and rarely thought about what she was saying. But at the same time, Cecilia liked being her little sister. Usually, illegitimate children are neglected and destined to live in poverty, but Alina really thought of Cecilia as a little sister, so she took care of her. But at this point, Alina couldn't stand it and started yelling at Kuchera, trying to find out why he was going so slow. After all, they were in a big hurry. And then an awkward Cecilia wondered if another quality of Alina was her impatience. Eventually, they began to approach the palace. Cecilia was delighted with the appearance of the palace, but Aline was displeased with the number of carriages. After all, she felt as if all the aristocrats of the empire were gathered here. But Cecilia calmly explained that after all this ball was organized by the Duke of Janikson, and he had hardly been out in public all this time and kept the mysterious image, that's why everyone was curious. That's why people gathered. But Alina didn't understand the reason for such attention, because everyone who wanted to had already seen his face. There was nothing to see. Especially the name Janikson spoke for itself, so last time, at his triumphal procession, there were also crowds of people. Then Cecilia remembered that in her previous life, 500 years ago, the name Janikson had been so common that it could be used for stones on the road. But at that time, she had known another boy, Janik. And recently Cecilia had thought of this boy, though they were not alike now. For not long ago, there had been a procession in their neighborhood. And then looking at the rider, Cecilia had realized what this duke looked like. That day, Aline was very unhappy that everyone came like ants to look at the man. But it was not strange, for Janikson was a hero of the sword, and thanks to him, the war with the high-rank barbarians was soon over, and he became the grand master of their time. Janikson's family originally had the right to act in ways that only the imperial family could. For example, they could make decisions about other aristocrats, and also everything about the history of the family and its members was kept from the public. Then Cecilia realized that this guy had nothing to do with the Janik she knew. The head of the Janikson family had been hidden from the public for a long time, and one day he suddenly showed his face and defeated the enemy warriors. Everyone, without exception, was amazed at what he revealed. He was a true hero of the sword. Janikson was called the Great Master, so Cecilia was initially surprised when she heard about him. However, there was no more mana in this world that was sufficient for a Grand Master to appear. In addition, the only source of mana needed for this to happen was Cecilia herself, but she was also destroyed for the public. But it didn't matter. Cecilia actually thought Janikson was very beautiful, and he was glowing. It was originally said that the more mana in a person's body, the more beautiful they are. So the original image of Hestia herself was also very beautiful. But suddenly, Cecilia noticed that Janikson was not happy at all, and he looked both lost of hope and full of rage. So this man seemed quite unusual to Cecilia, and it was as if he himself was dissatisfied with his existence. But suddenly the guy seemed to sense something. Janikson turned around, and then Cecilia realized that they had just met gazes almost by accident. Janikson immediately looked over to where Cecilia stood, thinking about the fact that he sensed a familiar mana. But he realized that he was probably imagining it, for the only one who possessed such mana was the girl who had left him alone in the distant past. Cecilia was trying to catch her breath. She didn't realize why she had hidden herself. It was an impulsive action. Cecilia tried to reassure herself that it was unlikely that Janikson was paying attention to her because there were so many other people downstairs besides her. And besides, she had a different appearance now, and maybe that look didn't mean anything. It was just that Cecilia was used to being ignored in this body, so Janikson's gaze seemed unusual to her. But suddenly, Cecilia heard a scream, and when she looked around, she saw that the poor child was now hanging from the ledge, and apparently the child had fallen when he looked up at the march. Then Cecilia pointed to the monument and explained that she had to climb the monument to save the child. Then Alina looked back at the monument herself and realized that if the child really fell on it now, he would probably die because the monument had too sharp a fence and parts. Hestia realized that she could easily save this child, but if she used magic now, it would cause too much unwanted attention, because magic had long since disappeared, and it was unlikely that Cecilia would be able to hide the fact that she had used magic. And if the existence of what was sealed inside Hestia became known again, she might have to relive the horrors of the past. Then the troubled man handed over the keys, explaining that they were the keys to the side door. He was the manager of the inn. He asked me to save the child. So the child went off, and then some lightning flew, and there was a lot of dust. And when the dust cleared, it was obvious to everyone that Janikson was the savior of the child, so everyone started to cheer for him. Then the hotel manager, looking at the destroyed buildings, didn't understand how he could make amends for the destroyed statue of the emperor. He was happy to have saved the child, but the loss was too great. The manager could not believe his happiness, but Janikson explained that the manager had told him himself that there was no one to make amends. Therefore, he should have silently taken the gem. Cecilia breathed a sigh of relief. She was glad that the child had been saved after all. But Hestia was sure that Janikson had obviously not been near the statue before, and she was sure that Janikson had chopped down 2 gates with his sword to get there. But suddenly the girl noticed that Janikson was whispering quietly. He was now thinking about the black-colored hair of the rescued child. But suddenly Alina's words snapped Cecilia out of her musings. Aliena explained that she wanted to take the place of the Duchess. Of course, Cecilia knew that Aliena loved power more than anything else in the world. Cecilia assumed that Aliena would sooner or later start looking for a partner of high status. But with her great ambition, Cecilia thought that Aliena would not choose Duke Janikson, who had no interest in politics or power, but the second son and emperor, who would be the future heir to the throne. So it was strange for Cecilia to hear that Aliena had changed her mind. Now Cecilia understood why Alina wanted to stand out so much at today's banquet. But she didn't know if people's opinion of her appearance could really change the situation and influence a man's choice. But still, Cecilia was optimistic, realizing that if her sister suddenly wanted something, she would definitely do it. And Cecilia would help her. After all, Cecilia wished that all her sister's dreams would come true. But though Cecilia had promised it to her sister, she was worried that the man really wasn't worth it. But suddenly she caught a glimpse of the Duke and couldn't realize if this was the right man. He was indeed very handsome, but what confused Cecilia more was that he was already drunk, even though the banquet hadn't even started. Cecilia was shocked. After all, the banquet was scheduled in honor of the Duke, but he didn't even bother to prepare an opening speech, and also there was always a strange atmosphere around him. So Cecilia was worried that Alina would be disappointed when she saw Duke Janikson. But paying attention to Alina, Cecilia realized that the girl was already disappointed, and there was irritation written on her face. And it seems Alina even started to hate the Duke. But suddenly, Cecilia noticed the Duke's servant. The girl hoped that the servants would bring the man to his senses as soon as possible before her sister's patience gave out. But the girl who suddenly appeared in the hall did not understand why everyone was standing around and doing nothing. It was a wonderful day, and she did not hear the ringing laughter. Cecilia did not understand why the girl appeared and spoke in such a way. After all, the Duke had not even had time to say a word, and they had already begun their speech. But after she realized that it was no wonder, because 2 princesses appeared. It was the second Princess Iris and the first Princess Yuria. Yuria announced to everyone that they should start the banquet arranged in honor of the grand victory won by their Grand Duke Janikson. Cecilia didn't understand why the princess decided to give the opening speech herself, as if she was similarly declaring that she would be the future consort of the Duke. Yuria also said that in the name of their imperial family, she was declaring that the radiance of the holy religion given to her should descend upon the empire. Cecilia was at once startled to hear of the holy relic. But then the ring on Uria's finger shone brightly, emitting light. And already after that, the girl announced the beginning of the banquet. All the people who absorbed this light were insanely grateful to Uriah for the blessing, and no one expected that she would decide to bless them with the holy relic. One of the men noticed that the scar he had received 20 years ago after his fall had started to fade, so everyone was wondering what great power was hidden in the sacred relic that had been passed down in the imperial family for generations. It was also a direct proof that the gods were still watching over their empire and protecting it. So everyone began to praise Princess Uriah, and the girl joyfully suggested that everyone present pay tribute to the soldiers who had sacrificed themselves for the safety of the empire, and explained that with the blessing of their deity, the souls of the dead would be appeased. But Janixon was very annoyed by Uriah's speech. After all, this power belonged to the woman they had self-murdered. Yet now, people boast of having a relic as if the relic were their own power. Rather than created with the blood and flesh of the dead Hestia, and despite how many centuries this relic had been passed down, Janixon was disgusted to look at it every time. He was also insanely bored. He wondered when Hestia would be reborn. While Janixon was waiting for her rebirth, he decided to get the highest position so that he could protect Hestia from anyone in the future. And also to give her anything she wanted. Janixon also made sure to get rid of all the people who could theoretically harm her, for he did not want this tragedy to happen again. But no matter how much gold and wealth Janixon accumulated, and no matter how many times he covered the empire with the most beautiful colors, and no matter how long he waited, Hestia never came back. So Janixon didn't understand what use he had for all that he had, and Janixon was very tired of this whole annoying world that Hestia was in. But suddenly, all the people present at the banquet smelled some pleasant fragrance. It was a very light scent of flowers and a very noble odor. And then Janixon realized that there could be no mistake, because this scent came from Hestia's mana. But he guessed that maybe the owner of this scent was no longer here, so he wanted to go outside to find out the source. But at that moment, the guy was stopped by the princess, not understanding why Janixon suddenly got up so abruptly and started to leave. But Janixon demandingly ordered Uriah to let herself go, after which he ripped his hand out of the princess's grip. Uriah was offended, not understanding how the Duke dared to treat her with such disrespect. But suddenly, all the aristocrats began to discuss this unfortunate situation. It was also rumored that when the first princess tried to persuade the Duke to marry her, he slammed the door right in front of the girl's nose and did not even listen to her. And now everyone was convinced that it was not a rumor, because before this, Uriah very confidently played the role of the future bride of Duke Janixon. Besides, the Duke himself was not publicly outraged. Uriah was annoyed that the very people who had praised her before were now slinging mud at her. And now she, the first princess, had been disgraced twice already. So Uriah was curious to see how long Duke Janixon would be able to ignore her. Meanwhile, a worried Alina was trying to bring her sister to her senses, not understanding what had happened to Cecilia and why she was getting so bad. At this time in pain, Cecilia pondered about the ring that the princess had taken with her. After all, if Cecilia knew that anyone present would take the sacred religion, Hestia would definitely not have come. Cecilia felt that she had lost her mana a little bit, because the power that was locked inside her was literally screaming with hunger during the last days. And now her power was out of control, trying to absorb the power of the sacred relic. And because of this resistance, Cecilia felt a lot of pain. The girl did not understand why this power caused her to suffer so much, and even die in her past life. But she could not escape this pain even after being reborn. Cecilia didn't understand why on earth, if she had to suffer even now, she was reborn at all. But suddenly looking at Alina's face, Cecilia saw a resemblance. It was her sister's troubled face that reminded her of a face from a past life. A girl who wished that after rebirth, she would have a life in which she would not have to deny herself anything, for it pained her very much that even the one Hestia, who was dear to her, had been taken from her by others. So she wished that after the rebirth, she would never be like that. And then Cecilia was sure that Alina was the right person. And although Hestia did not yet understand why her friend was reborn, she was very happy to meet Alina. Alina restlessly asked Cecilia to explain why she kept silent. The girl was worried that she might have angered her sister somehow. Then Cecilia remembered her promise. She promised she would do anything for Alina. So Cecilia forced herself not to worry. She could do the same trick she always did. All she had to do was draw a seal in her mouth and then keep the mana flowing out by sealing it inside. Eventually, Cecilia managed to seal her mana, but she realized that this condition would not go away until a few days later. And although she felt much better than before, it was still not ideal. Alina was angry and began to make Cecilia feel better, demanding that she explain what had happened to her. Cecilia awkwardly explained that she was perfectly fine and a little dizzy. Then, calming down, she began to discuss with her sister where his lordship the Duke had gone. Alina grudgingly reported that the jerk had just run off somewhere, which she was very unhappy about. Cecilia was disturbed by this news because she knew how much Alina wanted to dance with Duke Janikson. But Alina said that she was obviously not worried about some jerk, because Alina was much more worried about Cecilia. Then Cecilia tried to silence Alina, because if anyone could hear Alina talking about the Duke, they would think that she hated him. But Alina was not satisfied, and explained that she spoke quietly enough so no one but Cecilia could hear her. Then Cecily calmed down. She realized that she was worried because of the holy relic everything could go wrong. But everything went well enough. And also Cecilia was embarrassed that her sister had been so frightened about her health that she had even forgotten about the Duke. Of course, Cecilia was still sorry that the Duke had run away somewhere, and he must have upset Aliena very much, but perhaps it was even for the best. After all, if Alina had no other plans, they could leave early. But suddenly, a man came up and criticized the girls, explaining that they were being too loud. Cecilia was very confused, but Alina didn't like his tone. The man explained that the girls shouldn't shame the Count's family and behave like that. He didn't understand why the girls were always behaving like that. All the more, it seems they were not bothered by it. And his companion did not understand what Lady Alina was constantly so displeased about. But suddenly, all talk ended when Lady Veronica from Count Laren's family came into the hall. Cecilia began to worry, realizing that this meeting would not end well. And she did not understand why Veronica had come today to spoil her sister's mood even more. Because Alina hated Veronica too much, now Cecilia would hardly be able to easily pull her sister away and end their quarrel if it started. Alina smiled the sweetest smile and apologized to Lady Veronica for appearing before her in a way that belonged. And Cecilia did not understand why Alina was behaving like that, because it would be much better to just ignore this evil toad. Especially Cecilia Beautiful understood that, judging by Alina's feigned politeness, the girl was now incredibly angry. Alina also explained to Veronica that her sister was not feeling well, so she apologized and explained that they needed to leave the banquet first, for which Cecilia was incredibly grateful to her. Veronica explained that she was glad Alina had decided to leave the ball, although she was sure that the splendor of the banquet would definitely not be spoiled by the horrible dress Alina had chosen for herself and the low-born girl she had brought. And hitherto calmly, Alina seriously freaked out, demanding that Veronica repeat what she had said earlier if she dared. Veronica explained that she sympathized with Alina because she had come dressed up in such an extravagant dress to stand out and shine her beauty at the Duke of Janikson's ball, obviously so that the man would pay attention to her. And also, Aline had brought a low-born child to contrast her superiority, so that her superiority was clearly evident. And it seemed to Veronica that Alina must have been very upset when the Duke didn't even give her a single glance and immediately ran off in an unknown direction. Veronica reported the impropriety of Alina's outfit and expected Alina to know exactly what she was talking about. Veronica thought that Alina should know that for several years it had been customary to wear a dress in soft colors, but it was done on special occasions to honor the memory of those who had died in the war, so it must be a great shame for Alina that she had chosen to disregard this rule, although she had always been an example to the aristocrats. And Veronica wondered whether Aline was not ashamed to wear such a garish dress to the banquet in which they were honoring the memory of the dead. Cecilia began to worry because there were too many people watching the quarrel, and therefore she was worried that now Alina would get out of control and could hit Veronica, because it had happened before. So she had to stop Veronica, otherwise her sister could really hurt her, so Cecilia asked them to stop. Cecilia also remembered that Lady Veronica had made her debut only a year earlier than Aline, and it seemed that the girl had even succeeded in attracting public attention on her debut. But a year later, all the attention of aristocratic society was riveted on the clever and, though pretended, but polite Aline. And from that moment to this day, the more Veronica began to get to Alina, the more Alina tried to avoid conflicts by restraining her anger. But at one point, unable to withstand the eternal attacks from Veronica, Alina decided to no longer avoid conflicts. In addition, the dress that Alina was wearing was recommended by Cecilia because she thought that this dress could attract the attention of the Duke. So if Aliena could not become a duchess because of a badly chosen dress, it would be a real disaster. So standing up for her sister, Cecilia demanded that Veronica not be so rude, and explained that the dress Aline had been wearing before had been worn by the late Countess. So, as Veronica must know, after the Count had died in the war, his wife had supported the soldiers who had gone to that war to the very end. So when they were about to attend a banquet in honor of the much-anticipated victory, Cecilia thought that it would be wonderful if the Countess could attend it with them. So she had the idea of altering the dress that Madame had worn before her death and letting her sister wear it. In fact, it was still difficult for the girl to say all this, as she was experiencing complications due to Mana, but she hoped that she would succeed. After all, Cecilia was confident in her acting ability, after which the girl cried and turned to Alina and apologized to her, for it was very foolish to suggest such an outfit to Alina. So instead of doing something noble, it seems that Cecilia herself, without expecting it, insulted in this way the bright memory of the Countess and tarnished the honor of her sister. Then, seeing her tears, Aline became seriously angry and was not going to hold back. But as soon as she was about to explain herself to Veronica in a rougher tone, the other noblewomen could not believe that the girls had such a strong feeling of respect for the late Countess, and realized that this outfit was Aliena's inheritance. And it wasn't strange, for only 5 years ago everyone liked to wear brightly colored clothes. So they explained to Lady Veronica that it was very impolite to say something like that, and that it was wrong to accuse the girls without knowing the circumstances of the decision, after which the aristocrats went round to Cecilia and Aline and began to ask them how they had managed to give a second life to this dress in such a masterly way, for the dress looked incredibly stunning, and the girls even thought that it was bought in the most fashionable boutique. And some of them, since they saw the dress, immediately admired its beauty and even wanted to ask Alina for the boutique's business card in order to buy a similar dress. But Veronica was furious, not understanding how an illegitimate child could dare to allow herself so much that she even decided to communicate with her directly. It was especially unacceptable that an illegitimate child dared to talk about the majestic Countess. And in fact, such a mudblood wasn't even allowed to open her mouth. Veronica explained that if Cecilia didn't apologize and stop behaving like that, she would definitely become a disgrace to the whole family sooner or later. Veronica had also heard that all Cecilia was good at was singing, so she suggested that Alina get rid of the girl and make her a traveling singer, because that would be much more useful. Then I'm still in pain. Cecilia realized she had screwed up, and now she didn't know what to do. After all, her pain and severe dizziness was only getting worse. and Cecilia didn't think she could do anything about it. So she even started thinking about sneaking up on Veronica and casting some kind of spell to silence her. But suddenly, Alina, a fake smile, decided to discuss that earlier she had heard a conversation that His Majesty was looking for a worthy wife for the Duke, and also planned to organize a grand banquet, secretly inviting selected ladies to it. Cecilia did not understand if there was really such a conversation, as Alina had never mentioned it before. Alina also explained to Veronica that the list included not only her, but also other ladies from aristocratic families. But looking at the names of the invited ladies, Alina did not find Lady Veronica's name there at all, and Alina wondered why that was so. Veronica had absolutely no idea why Alina had so suddenly decided to start this conversation. Also, Alina explained that what she had heard earlier from Veronica had upset her very much. But it seemed to her that Veronica should have thought about improving her situation beforehand, instead of doing it at the last moment at the expense of others with unfounded accusations. After all, they were both daughters of count families, but it was Alina who had been chosen over Veronica. Veronica's reputation was so tarnished that she had not even been chosen as a worthy consort for the Duke. And Veronica didn't even have the same exquisite dress as her own sister, whom Veronica had called a mudblood. But the dress wasn't even worth talking about, considering her reputation, because even Veronica's complexion looked more like the dull mud on the roadway, except that it was Veronica's fault, not Alina's and her sister's. When the girl tried to swing, Alina skillfully took her arm and brought her closer. She explained to Veronica that she knew very well that Veronica was jealous of her and wanted to rise above Alina with all her might. But she warned her that if Veronica ever again said anything about her sister with her filthy mouth, especially pointing out that she was illegitimate or of mixed blood, Alina would do things to her that would make hell seem like heaven to Veronica. So Alina suggested that Veronica stop trying her patience. Cecilia was amazed that Alina was so good at eloquence in both her past life and present life. So Cecilia was even worried that the girl had memories of her past life. The aristocrats also began to chat about the fact that their princess was also wearing a red dress, the color of blood. So it was rather rude of Veronica to say such a thing in the room where the princess was. It was as if she was blaming the princess herself for choosing an inappropriate outfit. The aristocrats believed that the princess had chosen this color of dress to celebrate her victory, so surely a dress of this color would be very popular among the other young ladies. And even though Veronica wanted to shine, she made herself look as impolite and uncultured as possible. Alina calmly explained that Veronica herself should realize that she was the only one to blame for her situation. So Veronica herself made things worse. And then realizing the whole situation, the maid suggested that Veronica leave as soon as possible. She immediately turned around and humiliatedly walked away. Then Cecilia suspected that perhaps her sister had not originally lost her temper, for she feared that, because of the noise raised, they might have been the aggressors who tried to spoil the banquet by such inappropriate behavior. At this time, the excited ladies surrounding the girls sympathized with Alina, for they knew how kind-hearted she was. So it must have been very unpleasant for Alina to hear all these comments about her sister. Also, one of the noblewomen came to Cecilia and explained that the girl should not worry about what had happened, because it was very noble of her to honor in this way the memory of the countess who had passed away. Then Cecilia guessed that from the very beginning, Alina waited for the moment when all people would take their side, and Cecilia was pleased that the aristocrats from time to time could even talk to her and not ignore her. But all this was the merit of Alina, who did not stop taking her to official events and treated her as a human being, not belittling her for her origin and not ceasing to care for her welfare. In her past life, Hestia had played the role of protector for her sister, but in this life it was quite the opposite. So Hestia had a very strange feeling. But Cecilia could no longer bear such terrible pain. She felt as if she were going to faint. But it wasn't time to leave yet, so she had to hold on a little longer for the sake of her sister, who was bravely protecting her. Cecilia suggested that she should go to the restroom as soon as possible so that she could rest. But Cecilia convinced Alina that she could go alone, because it was more important that Alina should thank those who had stood up for them. Especially Cecilia thought all these aristocrats were wonderful people, and they could be a driving force in Alina's career in the future. And then looking at Cecilia, Alina admitted that sometimes the girl reminded her very much of some person, but she did not specify which one. Alina also realized that Cecilia was telling the truth, so she asked the girl to go and have a good rest. Then she went to the restroom and smiled one last time to Alina and her new acquaintances. Then she closed the doors and fell to the ground. Cecilia realized that if Veronica hadn't shown up and pestered them at such a bad time, she would have been able to immediately suppress her strength and get a good rest. Therefore, she was very unlucky. Cecilia was getting worse. She was gradually beginning to lose her senses, and perhaps earlier she had relaxed too much when she thought she was in no danger. Because she could no longer control her mana, Hestia's transforming spell that was hiding her appearance began to break down. But suddenly, the aristocrats began to whisper when they saw the Duke return to the banquet hall. But they didn't understand why the Duke had decided to return at the very end of the banquet. Even the princesses had left the banquet to go home, but the Duke himself was not bothered by the rules of propriety. He had gone around all he could, but nowhere could he look for the source of the fragrance. And after a couple of laps, he decided to go back. So now it seemed to him that he had become crazy. And perhaps because of his longing for Hestia, he fancied he smelled the scent of her mana. But suddenly the Duke sensed something strange from outside. Alina didn't like the fact that Janixon was still completely unconcerned about the guests. After all, he hadn't even spoken a word to anyone, so it looked very ignorant. But she noticed that Janixon was looking in the same direction at the balcony where Cecilia was. At this time, Cecilia was giving orders to her assistant. She explained to the bat that as soon as he could find Veronica, he should quickly heal her wound on her arm that Alina had left behind, then quickly go back. Though Cecilia was sure that knowing Veronica, such a wretch would most likely re-inflict herself early after recovering. And then there would be a lot of unnecessary problems. So Cecilia asked that her assistant should follow the girl and by no means let her inflict a fresh wound on herself for a couple of days. And then the joyous bat flew away. Cecilia was still worried, not realizing how right it was to give such an important mission to an aide, for perhaps she should have fully recovered her mana first, and afterwards thought it over well and sent the familiar on the mission. But Veronica was unpredictable, and there was no telling what her next move would be, and maybe it wouldn't be a big deal if her assistant successfully completed the mission without being seen by anyone. But Cecilia realized that now was not the time for such thoughts. She had no idea what would happen to the bat while he was on his mission, but now it was more important for Hestia to get back the mana that had left her body and seal it safely inside. Hestia realized that she would most likely be in pain again, though she couldn't even remember a time when she hadn't felt pain from possessing that mana. But apparently it was her destiny, so she cast the spell and used the magic ball to seal the power, and thought about how long she would have to endure this unbearable pain, and how long she would have to suffer for it in the future. Janixon, who approached, immediately heard a strange rumbling behind the door. But when he opened the door, he found the girl unconscious in front of him. Janixon realized that he must have made a mistake and wasted his time. But he picked her up anyway, trying to understand why she was lying there and suspecting that she might have had too much to drink. Laying her down on the bench and looking around, Janixon realized she might be an aristocrat, though she didn't look much like one. Janixon also calmed down and realized that the fresh air must be good for him, because up until that moment when he had experienced the obsession, he had felt quite strange. But it seemed to be the first time he had felt peaceful since Cecilia's death. But looking at Cecilia, he realized that the girl had not a very healthy complexion. She must have been sick. It wasn't strange because people get sick quite often. So Janixon realized that he had to call the servants and ask them to bring something to cover her with. Janixon remembered that Hestia had been sick a lot earlier as well. Although Janixon still didn't know what he was doing, he turned to Hestia, confessing to her that he had lost his mind, and he couldn't believe that for a moment he was interested in someone other than Hestia herself, because Jannikson knew very well that they would meet Hestia again someday. If at that moment Jannikson was with someone other than Hestia, she would leave him. But not with a feeling of jealousy at all, but with a feeling of relief. Jannikson didn't understand why, even though he had become so callous to everything, he still wanted to hear her affectionately call him Yannick again. He remembered how he had once come to Cecilia, and the girl didn't understand why Jannik was looking at her that way again. She had asked him to go to bed, but he cried, and didn't understand if Cecilia was so hurt. But she kept telling Jannik that she was all right and asked him to leave. At this point, Cecilia opened her eyes. She felt quite strange, and also worried that she had been having similar dreams lately. Cecilia knew that she had been having a hard time for a while because of Jannikson, but still she was attached to the guy. But suddenly, Cecilia realized that she felt much better now than before, so she decided to go back to her sister. But suddenly Cecilia found herself on the bench and couldn't understand where she got the blanket from. Also, Cecilia was curious about how her familiar was doing and hoped that he was able to fulfill the request. At this time, Veronica was frantic looking around her hand, and the wound she had taken was gone. Especially, no matter how Veronica tried to re-injure herself, no marks were left at all, and there was no way she could have hurt herself. Veronica was terrified. She couldn't hurt herself, not only on her arm, but on her face and the rest of her body. She was going to use the wound left by Alina as an excuse to ask her father to destroy Alina. But if it went on like this, she wouldn't be able to get her revenge properly. But Veronica suspected that perhaps it was due to the power the princess had used on them earlier. Veronica realized that this was most likely the problem and didn't understand why the princess had used her magic today, because if it wasn't for that magic, her plan would have come to fruition. Then Veronica decided that in this case she should act more roughly. She decided to cut herself with a knife of some kind, so she started running down the corridors in search of her maid. Veronica didn't know where the knives were, and even though she had ordered her maid to stay away from her earlier, it seemed strange to her that the maid would do that. So Veronica promised herself that as soon as they got home, she would re-educate the maid. But suddenly she bumped into Jannikson and started cursing, not understanding why the guy wasn't looking where he was going. But suddenly he lifted her hand, and that's when he noticed that Veronica's hand was enveloped in magic. It definitely wasn't a mistake, and it was magic power, though it was weak to the point that it couldn't be felt by someone with weak mana. But in Jannikson's case, it was easy enough to feel. So he demanded Veronica to explain where and with whom she had been when this trace was left, but suddenly noticed a small familiar that was next to the girl. At that moment, Hestia opened her wings and flew up into the sky, thinking about how she would like to leave this horrible banquet and take a bath in warm water and go to bed. But unfortunately, it was already time to start, for there was one thing she could not avoid. It was the rite of the full moon. Hestia remembered that in the era when magic was used everywhere, the temple was the source of magic. The priests not only cured the sick, but also practiced politics and made weapons. But 500 years ago, for reasons unknown, after the Great War, the world lost most of its magic. Temple writing and ethics remained a mandatory part of the imperial aristocracy's culture, and the most powerful magical items were renamed sacred objects, which were then passed down through generations in the imperial family. But the stories of the priests' insatiable greed for power and the horrific bloodshed they caused were silenced and not passed down through the generations. Eventually, Cecilia arrived at the necessary spot near the sacred tree, illuminated by moonlight, and to the ruined site where the temple used to be, and memories immediately crept into her head. Hestia admitted that as every time she had been to this place, it felt as if these events were just yesterday. She remembered the days when the three of them had spent time with her sister, who had been her maid in the past, at the temple, and the guy they wanted to make immortal, Yannick. But suddenly, Hestia began to breathe heavily, which meant the process had begun. When the full moon was at its peak, Hestia was no longer able to suppress her mana. Mana, trying to take advantage of this opportunity, was frantically getting rid of the vessel. And if Hestia were to show weakness for even a second, and this power could be released, it would destroy all the people in the Empire. And Hestia was never going to let that happen. This power was never supposed to enter their world in the first place. But Hestia couldn't hold it inside her for long. Of course, there was one way to protect people, but Hestia didn't want to resort to that. All Hestia could do now was to seal herself inside the vessel, along with the sealed power, and feed the vessel to wait inside until the sealed power's attempts to escape stopped. At this time, the excited assistants galloped after the prince, asking him to stop, for it was too dangerous to ride a horse so fast through the forest path. And moreover, they were too far from civilization, so they had to go back. But the prince didn't care at all. His aides didn't understand what had happened to the prince, for he had even decided not to attend the banquet in honor of the duke. But they assumed that maybe it was due to his condition, because he was strange since he returned from the war with the barbarians. After his return, the duke was recognized as a hero. Aesor began to hate Janixon, for if Aesor could, he would like to erase Janixon and that moment from his memory. Aesor still remembered his dazzling gleam of the sword blade and phenomenal strength. So Janixon is quite capable of easily taking the place of the crown prince with that kind of power. Aesor couldn't believe that he was even an ordinary person. After all, the prince had also spent his entire life honing his sword skills, yet it was Janixon who had such incredible skills. And even though Janixon had dared to insult the prince's sister, Princess Yuria, the king didn't care, because he didn't want to fall out of favor with the duke. And Duke Janixon was no longer a hermit hiding in the shadows. He had dangerous power, magic, and influence over the imperial family, and incredible sword power. So the prince was well aware that the duke would be a stumbling block even after he ascended the throne. But suddenly the prince stopped. He was surprised that he hadn't even noticed he'd gotten this far because of his worries. So Aesor apologized to his knights, for he didn't want to cause them so much inconvenience before nightfall. Aesor realized that as a future ruler, he shouldn't behave so frivolously, so he suggested that they go back as soon as possible. But suddenly everyone felt something. The knights thought that there was a strong wind, but no one understood what it was related to. But the prince realized that this wind was unusual. It was magical. You can't feel something like this if you're a weak mage or have no mana. But he didn't understand where such strong magic came from in the Empire, so Aesor assumed it was an invader and led his men onward. While in her vessel Hestia begged for salvation, she felt as if her body was going to be torn to pieces. She wanted it to stop. She remembered her oldest memory from her past life. It was when Hestia, as a little girl dressed in white clothes, entered the Temple of Light. It seems the priests wanted to create an immortal child out of her through experimentation. They kept cutting her up and stitching her back together, and then doing it all over again. They also gave her all sorts of poisons. But no matter what they did, Hestia's body would instantly regenerate, which made them mad, because all the effects of the experiments were gone. But then, given her peculiarities, the priests decided to seal something inside Hestia that should never come out. No one really knew what this sealed evil was or where it came from, and even Cecilia herself had never seen anything like it. But even so, she knew instinctively that it must never be released. Otherwise, all living things would end. It's not for nothing that the doctors codenamed it evil. Cecilia survived even after it was implanted in her. She continued to grow as a normal person. The priests were disappointed because they wanted to make her immortal at least this way, but the girl never understood their wishes and wanted it to stop. One day, one priest learned that her blood could activate the power in a sealed body, and the others decided to make special relics out of her flesh and blood. And it seems these relics are still used and passed down in the imperial family to this day. Hestia had always wondered how long they planned to abuse her, because there was no end to it, though she had already realized that it was unlikely to stop judging by the greed of these people. They were sure that Hestia did not know the truth, But she knew very well that soon the priests were planning to perform a ritual so that the creature that was inside her could get out by tearing her flesh. She knew that the children of the Empire and the people could have died if Hestia hadn't saved them. So she decided not to think about her future death anymore and just think about what she could do for the people while alive. Because those thoughts always made her feel better. But she still didn't understand why the priests wanted to do this, even though many of the test subjects had died. Hestia wondered how much more she had to suffer and why she had been reborn again, and how she had managed to meet her sister. But Hestia realized that if she tried not to remember it again, perhaps the next day she could smile as brightly as before. But suddenly her cocoon shattered, and then everyone witnessed the appearance of the girl. Everyone was amazed, and Hestia didn't notice them yet, happy that it was all over. But suddenly, she found the prince, and also his assistants, so she immediately took to the sky and started to fly away. Everyone was amazed at her speed, and did not realize whether they should catch up with this girl and asked the prince for advice. But he calmly looked around the place where Hestia was, and noticed her feather there. While in the mansion, Cecilia was very worried, for she had never seen any human being in that place before. But this time she had no luck at all. So Cecilia tried to convince herself that everything would be all right. She hoped she'd never meet those people again. But suddenly, from the open door, she heard a scream belonging to her sister. Then Cecilia immediately remembered that the same scream had been heard by her maid, who had begged her mistress to run away, and the priests had stopped her with all their might. The girl didn't understand why the mistress didn't run away, and promised that Janixon would definitely help her not to get caught by people. The girl didn't understand why Hestia was willing to sacrifice her life for the sake of such freaks who tormented her so much. And she didn't care what would happen if Hestia didn't do what she was forced to do, because Mistress Hestia was much more important to her than anyone else, so she shouldn't have to sacrifice herself for anyone else. When Cecilia came to Alina's room, she saw the girl crying and calling for Mistress Hestia. Cecilia realized that the girl was having bad nightmares, so she sat down beside her bed on her knees and began to soothe her and sing a song. Her older sister had told Cecilia since she was a little girl that she had nightmares all the time, but she never told the contents. But each time Cecilia became more and more convinced that Alina was her friend from the past, because it was obvious from the lines Alina made in her dreams. So Alina became her only friend who also reincarnated. This meant only one thing. Cecilia was not born alone. After reincarnation, for reasons unknown to Hestia, the girl was very confused and lonely. So Cecilia thought that it was good that her friend did not remember anything from her past life, because that life was full of painful memories. So it was good that only Hestia remembered it. She also realized during this time together that when she sang songs to her sister, it calmed her down quickly enough. Cecilia also hoped that soon Alina would start to dream not terrible dreams, but some nice, good ones, because she wanted the girl to be happy at least in this life. At this time, Alina had a dream where she was running around with Hestia and was having a joyful time. Hestia explained to the girl that she was having a lot of fun with her. After all, she was now her only friend. But that word seemed strange to the girl. Hestia explained that friends are people who are considered very close. She excitedly explained that no one had ever called her that before. In fact, the girl didn't really have a name, but he decided that from now on she would be called a friend, because it was Hestia who called her that way. When Alina woke up, Toe didn't realize what kind of dream it was, but immediately went to the room where she was dressed up. She promised that today she would focus all her attention on the Duke. Then Cecilia realized that her sister had been in an overly combative mood all morning. But Alina knew that the banquet in honor of the victory won by the Duke and the other knights would last for 3 days, so she should take advantage of that time. But Alina also warned that only invited aristocrats could attend today's banquet, so she asked Cecilia to stay and wait for her in her room, and not to run around the building and look at all the glittery decorations. Cecilia was embarrassed that her sister had accused her of such a thing, though it was true. But she agreed, though she didn't understand why her sister wanted to be a duchess. For Janikson seemed to her a very strange man, and she was worried about her sister. And in Cecilia's opinion, it would be better for Alina to become the wife of the prince of their country, because he is the heir to the throne, is good with a sword, very friendly, and not lacking in beauty. Although Cecilia only knew of him from rumors, but Alina explained that she had good reasons to do so and asked Cecilia to fulfill her requests because Alina had to leave, because today there would be fewer guests and the hall would not be so crowded, so Alina would have a better chance to attract the Duke's attention. Cecilia realized that in such a case, she just needed to hold her sister in her ambition to become a duchess. But she was against it anyway. Suddenly, Alina assumed that she must have had nightmares again, for she had heard Cecilia singing a song for her through her sleep. So Alina thanked the girl happily. Cecilia was also happy that her song seemed to have helped and felt happy. After a while being in the banquet hall of Jonikson's mansion, Alina was madly angry, not realizing where that vile, disgusting man was. She'd rather get drunk than attract his attention. The Duke didn't seem interested in finding a lady of the heart, although Aline also thought that she might have come here too soon. And she was also very worried whether her sister was sitting quietly in her room or whether she was somewhere walking around the mansion looking at all the glitter and jewelry. In fact, Cecilia was busy doing just that. So she was walking through the hallways looking at all the jewelry and marveling that everything was decorated with gold and jewels. But suddenly everyone was shocked to see that Duke Janikson was escorting Lady Veronica. And even Aliena was shocked. I don't understand how the Duke could have come here with this girl. It sounded like a joke. At this time, Cecilia was admiring all the gold jewelry, for the Duke's residence was literally all shining with gold and precious stones. And the girl wanted at least one of these precious vases for herself. But suddenly she heard a scream, so she immediately hid, thinking that she had no time to do anything. But as it turned out, it was Uria's scream. The princess tried to calm down, but she was terrified and kept screaming that Janikson had dared to make his partner some pathetic Lady Veronica, the daughter of a common baron, while rejecting her, the princess of this kingdom. And even Cecilia herself was completely flabbergasted by it. Cecilia realized that this news was very bad, for Aline might turn everything in the banquet hall upside down because of anger. But the man tried to calm Julia by explaining that Janikson had never done anything normal and had always done something that caused a public outcry. But Julia was also furious with her brother's behavior because he had always taken her side and defended her before. But today, for some reason, he continues to stare at a feather all day long, while uttering a minimum number of phrases. Then Cecilia realized that she had seen a man standing next to the princess. At that time, Yuria demanded that her brother give her this strange feather, but he had no intention of doing so. The prince explained to his sister that even though they were related, he could not give her the feather because it belonged to him. Then the frightened Cecilia realized that this was the same man she had seen yesterday, and it turned out that he was not a simple knight, but the brother of the princess and also the crown prince. She was very afraid that she had given herself away in front of the prince of this country, and although it was probably the feather he had gotten at the temple, then there was hardly anything wrong, though surely the imperial family must have records of Hestia's past life. But she could not try to take the feather from the prince, for in so doing she might reveal her true identity. But Cecilia decided that now was not the time to worry about it, for she could always think about it afterwards. For now, she was more worried about her sister, so Cecilia thought about summoning her familiars and sneaking into the ballroom to get Alina. But suddenly, Cecilia found that for some reason she couldn't summon her familiars. At that moment, Janikson was thinking about the bat he had found. It was very similar to Hestia's familiar. She had won 500 years ago, so there could be no mistake. The girl had the same mana as Hestia, and apparently Hestia was reborn, and this time it wasn't a dream or an obsession. So Janikson wondered where the girl was now. He had to find his Hestia, but this was conveyed by the events before the second day of the banquet. For Janikson arrived at the mansion of Veronica Liren's family. There, the frightened Count explained to Jannikson that he did not understand the reason why Jannikson wanted to see his daughter, but explained that if suddenly Veronica made were a mistake, he is ready to deeply apologize to Jannikson. The Count asked the Duke to go back to where he came from, but Jannikson calmly explained to the Count that he wished to accompany his daughter, and that he would not repeat his demand twice. The Count had already heard that his daughter was in serious trouble, and didn't understand what Veronica had done if Duke Jannikson himself decided to visit their residence. Now, all attention was focused on Jannikson, so the Count couldn't somehow get closer to the Duke with the help of his daughter, because it would mean that their family had absolutely no respect for the imperial family, and Princess Yuria in particular, who wanted to become Jannikson's future wife. In addition, the Count could not let Jannikson control his daughter as he wished, given the way Veronica was obsessed with the Duke, for it would surely cause a huge problem in the future. So he needed to send Jannikson back by any means necessary. The Count explained that he was sorry and wanted to talk to the girl personally, but Jannikson urged the Count to shut up because the man was wasting his time, and so they should change the way they negotiated. He provided very rare siren tears in the amount of 20 pieces, and the Count could take them, after which he should immediately call his daughter. The frightened man knew that these were rare jewels only found in the deep sea, and also one of the most expensive minerals in the empire. Each of these crystals was worth as much as real estate in the capital of the country. But when the Count did not give his decision, Jannikson suspected that this was not enough, offered him as many as 50 gems. Then the Count was even more frightened. He had thought that the Duke was just a title holder, but it turned out that he had supernatural powers for a man, and also had power over the fates of aristocrats. Plus all of the above, he was also incredibly rich. And despite the fact that Jannikson was a recluse, he was able to combine everything. Then looking back at her watch, Jannikson realized that just one lost second was too much. Jannikson had originally decided to use the quickest way to negotiate. Because his patience was wearing thin, he had waited long enough. He thought the Count was an idiot if he didn't sense the urgency of the matter Jannikson had come to deal with. But Jannikson also realized that there was no peaceful way to settle the matter, so he asked the Count if he really wanted to be destroyed. The man was immediately frightened and explained that he would call his daughter right away. The Count didn't know for what reason the Duke wanted to do such a thing, but Jannikson was a man with the power to destroy an entire kingdom. Presently, in Duke Jannikson's estate, all eyes were fixed on Veronica, for which she was immensely glad. She was especially glad of her victory over Alina, for as expected the place next to the Duke would never belong to her, for he had not even made a choice in her favor. But the Duke, turning to Veronica, ordered her not to look around and to hurry up and do everything as he ordered. After all, she also needed to check if all the people Veronica had seen earlier had arrived here today. Then the girl convinced the Duke that she had already checked everything and suspected that Jannikson was looking for someone. Veronica knew that Cecilia was not an illegitimate child, but in Veronica's opinion, she was automatically crossed off the list, so she wasn't even worth worrying about, because the Duke was definitely not looking for her. Veronica still didn't understand who the Duke was looking for, but he needed Veronica for his plan, and she wanted to use this chance to humiliate everyone who had humiliated her before. So she was already dreaming of a future place as a duchess, and she was curious to see the faces of all the people at that moment. And also, she would really like to get rid of one disgusting bat that was always following her. And Veronica didn't understand why the Duke made her wear the bat always around her. Jannikson ordered Veronica to follow him as well as these slowly, keeping her back straight. She agreed, though she asked the man to stop a little, for Veronica perfectly understood that if the Duke wanted her, she should take full advantage of him while she had the chance, and explained to the Duke that she would do as he wished. But initially he had a request. Jannikson immediately became more displeased, but still listened to the girl. Veronica explained that her father had asked her to tell the Duke that the Count wanted the jewels that Jannikson had given him back. After all, if anyone found out about this, their family could be in big trouble. And now that Veronica had relayed her father's request, she wanted Janikson to dance the first dance with her to open the ball.